James Bond should be perfect for video games. You have the gadgets, the cars, the suits, the villains, the exotic locations, the romance, the danger, and of course, the license to kill. On paper, it almost writes itself, but Bond games have always had a strange history. Some are remembered as classics, others disappeared almost completely, and for a long time it felt like the James Bond license was just waiting for the right studio to bring it back properly. That is why 007 First Light had so much attention around it. This time it was developed by IO Interactive, the studio best known for Hitman, so naturally, a lot of players expected one thing: Hitman, but with a mix of James Bond. After playing it on PlayStation 5, I can say this clearly: that is not what 007 First Light is. There are moments where you can feel IO's DNA, some stealth ideas, some mission structures, some infiltration flavor, but this is not a Hitman reskin. It is not a full sandbox stealth game, and if that is what you're expecting, you may walk away disappointed. 007 First Light is so much closer to a cinematic story-driven Bond adventure. It is a game built around atmosphere first. It wants you to feel like James Bond. It wants you inside the world of spies, expensive suits, dangerous villains, gadgets, car chases, close quarters fights, and dramatic mission briefings. And in that area, I think it succeeds. It is not perfect, the stealth could definitely be stronger, the action does not happen as often as I personally wanted, and some players will find the gameplay a bit too guided compared to Hitman. But as a Bond experience, this game understands the assignment. So today, I want to talk about the story, gameplay, stealth, combat, driving, gadgets, graphics, and overall Bond atmosphere. Most importantly, I want to answer the question: is 007 First Light worth buying? The most important thing to understand before buying 007 First Light is what kind of a game it is. This is not a pure stealth game, it is not a massive open world game, it is not a traditional shooter either. It mixes all of these things, but the foundation is clearly narrative. The story is the main driver, the missions, the gameplay, the set pieces, and even the quieter sections are all built around pushing Bond's journey forward. That can be a positive or a negative depending on what you want. If you're coming in as a Bond fan or as someone who enjoys cinematic action adventure games, this approach works very well. The game gives you the feeling of being inside a Bond film. You are moving through stylish locations, dealing with dangerous situations, using gadgets, getting into fights, driving through dramatic sequences, and watching the story unfold around you. But if you're coming in as mainly because IO Interactive made Hitman and you're a fan of it, you need to lower that specific expectation. 007 First Light does have stealth, it does have some areas where you can approach situation carefully, but it is not designed around the same level of freedom as Hitman. This is a more directed game. For me, that was not a problem because I quickly realized the game is trying to be something else. It is not asking you to master one giant sandbox, it is trying to deliver the fantasy of becoming James Bond. And that is where the game is at its strongest. The best way to describe it is this: 007 First Light is not a game about being the perfect assassin. It is a game about becoming the world's most famous spy. That difference matters. I will keep this review spoiler-free because the story is one of the main reasons to play the game. What I will say is that 007 First Light clearly treats its story as the heart of the experience. This is not a game where the narrative is just there to connect missions together. The story is the reason the game exists, and I think that was the right decision. Bond is not just about gameplay mechanics, he's a character, a style, a world, and a certain kind of fantasy. If you remove the story, the charm, the danger, and the spy atmosphere, then Bond becomes just another action hero with a famous name. 007 First Light avoids that. The game gives you a Bond who is younger and in the process of becoming the man everyone knows. That gives the story a bit more room to breathe, because it's not just trying to copy the films, it is building its own version of the character. And that is one of the things I like the most. The game understands the classic Bond ingredients. You have the Secret Service world, you have the gadgets, you have the over-the-top villains, you have the romance, you have the danger, you have the dramatic locations, and you have that old spy DNA running through the whole thing. It feels like Bond. Not every moment is perfect, and some parts are clearly more cinematic than mechanically deep, but the story kept me interested. I wanted to see where the mission was going, I wanted to see how the character developed. I wanted to see how the game would build this younger version of Bond into 007. That is important because this is not a game carried only by gameplay. The story and atmosphere do a lot of heavy lifting. If you are someone who skips cutscenes and only cares about mechanics, that may be an issue. But if you enjoy games that pull you into the world, This is where 007 First Light works really well. This is the biggest strength of the game. 007 First Light makes you feel like James Bond. That might sound simple, but for a Bond game, it is the most important thing. A James Bond game cannot just be a generic shooter with a famous license. It needs elegance, it needs danger, it needs that charm, it needs some violence, but not in a messy or random way. It needs style above everything else. It needs villains who feel larger than life. It needs gadgets that feel clever without turning the game into science fiction nonsense. It needs action, but it also needs class. This game gets most of that right. From the way missions are presented, to the way characters speak, to the locations, gadgets, music, cinematic moments, 007 First Light feels like it was built by people who understand what Bond is supposed to be. It has that mixture of seriousness and exaggeration that the franchise needed. The gameplay is a mix of stealth, shooting, hand-to-hand combat, gadgets, driving, and narrative exploration. Instead of focusing on one system and building the entire game around it, 007 First Light moves between different styles of gameplay, depending on what the story needs. A mission might begin with a quiet infiltration, shift into gadget use, then escalate into combat or driving sequence. Other sections slow the pace down and focus more on the world, the characters, and the tension of being inside a spy operation. That variety fits Bond very well. Bond is not just a soldier, he is not just a detective. He's not an assassin, he's a spy who moves between different situations, often with very little warning. One moment requires charm and control, the next requires violence, the next requires improvisation. The game understands the rhythm. The problem is that not every gameplay system is equally strong. For me, the strongest parts are the story, the atmosphere, and the hand-to-hand combat. The shooting is solid as well. The driving adds some variety, and the gadgets give the game personality. But the stealth is the area where I expected more polish. That does not mean the gameplay is bad, it is enjoyable overall, but it's not the kind of game where every system feels deep enough to stand on its own. Instead, the gameplay works best as part of the full Bond package. When everything comes together, the setting, the music, the gadgets, and everything else, it feels really great. When one system is isolated, especially stealth, the weakness becomes more obvious. Stealth is probably the most complicated part of this review because this is IO Interactive we're talking about here. A lot of players are going to expect stealth to be one of the strongest parts of 007 First Light. That expectation is fair. Hitman built its reputation on careful planning, disguise systems, open-ended levels, and creative problem-solving. 007 First Light has some of that influence, but it does not go that far. The stealth here is serviceable. Gives you some tension, it supports the spy fantasy, lets you move through restricted areas, avoid the tension, use gadgets if you need to, and feel like you are infiltrating dangerous places. But I would not call it great. It is not bad enough to ruin the game, but it's not as polished or flexible as I hoped. Some sections feel more scripted than they should. Some encounters could have offered more interesting options. And there were moments where I wanted the game to trust me more as a player, to be honest. That is where Hitman comparison hurts the game. The good news is that stealth still fits in the overall Bond fantasy. Bond does sneak and he does infiltrate. But he's also not Agent 47. He's more emotional, more visible, and more explosive. So I understand why the game does not build everything around silent perfection. Still, if there is one area I want improved in a sequel, it would be stealth. Combat is where the game worked much better for me. The shooting is solid, but the hand-to-hand combat is easily my favorite part of the gameplay. There is something about close quarters fighting that fits James Bond perfectly. He should not feel like a generic action hero with unlimited ammunition. He should feel trained, dangerous, and capable of turning a bad situation around with his body, his instincts, and whatever is nearby. 007 First Light captures that feeling very well. The game often limits your ammo enough that you cannot shoot your way through everything from a safe distance. That pushes you closer to enemies, and that is where the combat becomes more cinematic. When the hand-to-hand combat kicks in, the game feels more like a Bond movie. It becomes less about clearing enemies in a mechanical way and more about surviving a chaotic scene with style. That is exactly what I wanted from the action. The game makes you feel like Bond is dangerous even when he is not fully in control. He can be outnumbered, low on ammo, or caught off guard, but he still feels capable. That is a difficult balance to hit, and I think the game gets it right. My main complaint is that I wanted more of it. The action scenes are good, but they are not as frequent as I expected. Because the game focuses so much on story, it sometimes falls back when I wanted it to push harder. That is not necessarily a deal breaker. In fact, the restraint probably helps the pacing in some areas. But personally, I would have liked a few more big combat moments. Still, when the action arrives, it works. And the hand-to-hand combat is one of the main reasons I enjoy the game. Driving is another part of Bond fantasy that needed to be here. A Bond game without driving would feel incomplete. The cars are part of that identity. The chase scenes, the luxury, the speed, and the danger, all of that belongs in this world. In 007 First Light, the driving sections are not trying to be a racing game. They are not deep enough for that, and they do not need to be. They are there for spectacle, pacing, and atmosphere. And in that role, they work. The driving gives the game a different energy. It breaks up the rhythm between stealth, combat, and story scenes. It also gives you those moments where the game leans full into cinematic Bond action. Could the driving have been deeper? Yes. Would I have liked more of it? Probably. But I would rather have driving used at the right moments than forced into the game constantly just because Bond is associated with cars. As part of the full experience, the driving helps sell the fantasy. It adds flavor, it adds speed, and it reminds you that this is not just a stealth game or a shooter. It is a Bond game. The gadgets are another important ingredient of the 007 experience. They give the game personality, they make Bond feel different from a normal action hero. And they help create the classic spy feeling where a small device can change the way a situation plays out. What I liked is that the gadgets feel connected to the world. They are not just random tools thrown into the game for the sake of it. They support the fantasy of being prepared, trained, and backed by MI6 technology. When the gadget use is integrated well into a mission, the game feels much more like Bond. You are not just moving through a level, you are using the tools of the spy world to create an opening, solve a problem, or get yourself out of the trouble. That said, I do think this is yet another area that could be expanded in the future. I would love to see more gadget variety, more creative uses, and more moments where the game lets you experiment. The gadgets are good, but there is room to make them even more central to the experience. Still, what is here works. They help give 007 First Light its identity, and they add another layer to the Bond atmosphere. On PlayStation 5, 007 First Light looks very good, but what impressed me the most was not just the technical side, it was the presentation. This is a stylish game. The lighting, the environments, the character scenes, the mission briefings, the camera work, they all help create that Bond feeling. The game looks expensive, and that matters. Bond should not feel cheap. The world should have elegance, danger, and scale. Whether you are in a quiet story scene or a more dramatic action moment, the presentation does a lot to make the game feel like a premium spy adventure. So, who is 007 First Light actually for? I think it is for players who want to experience a cinematic James Bond story. If you care about atmosphere, story, gadgets, characters, and villains, and feeling like you are stepping into the role of 007 especially, this game is easy to recommend. It understands Bond, it gives you the old spy DNA, it gives you the action, it gives you the romance, it gives you the villains, and it gives you the gadgets. But if you are buying this mainly because you want the next Hitman, or you are expecting some kind of open world sandbox, you should be careful. This is not that game. It has some stealth mechanics and you can see traces of IO style, but this is much more focused on story and cinematic pacing than systemic freedom. The same applies if you mainly want constant action. There is action here and some of it is very good, but the game does not throw combat at you every 5 minutes. It takes its time, it builds the world, it lets the story lead. For me, that aspect worked, but for some players it may feel too slow or too controlled. That is why my verdict is positive, but not universal. 007 First Light is a very good Bond game. It is not necessarily a perfect game for every player. So, is it worth buying? For me, yes. I would say buy it now if you're a Bond fan or if you enjoy cinematic story-driven games, and if you understand that this is not trying to be Hitman with a different license. This is a story-first Bond adventure. The stealth could be better, the action could appear more often, some levels could offer more freedom, and players who care mostly about gameplay depth may feel that the game does not go that far. The story kept me invested, the atmosphere is excellent, the hand-to-hand combat is satisfying. probably the best part of the game. The gadgets and driving help complete the fantasy, the presentation is strong, and most importantly, the game made me feel like James Bond. This is the part I keep coming back to. Even with the flaws, 007 First Light understands the character. It understands that Bond is not just about shooting, it is about confidence, style, danger, charm, violence, and control. It is about walking into impossible situations and somehow making it look like you belong there. This game captures that feeling better than I expected. If you want a cinematic Bond experience with story, gadgets, villains, romance, driving, and that stylish action, then 007 First Light is absolutely worth playing. If you enjoyed this review, subscribe to GamesOracle for more gaming reviews, retrospectives, and honest breakdowns. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.